and a very warm welcome. My name is Mette Amdi, and I am Program Manager here at CBS Executive Funding, where we see it as one of our foremost and finest purposes to enlighten and empower executives and board members to make better and more sustainable solutions. And this is why we are running a series of these kind of morning briefs, where this is actually number 7 in a row. And don't panic if you haven't seen all of them. We'll send you a link to the other previous morning briefs afterwards. So, very warm welcome, and today's topic is a little bit different from the other sessions that we've had today. It is specifically with a board perspective. So we are running this session beyond awareness, how boards can integrate sustainability into their decision making. Yes, and a few practical things. We are running for the next 45 minutes, and we are running this session as a webinar, which means that you can answer questions along the way in the little Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and then we will monitor and see if we can make it through all of the questions along the session. And in a minute, I will actually like you to be ready to participate a little bit and be active from the morning. So please have your phone within reach, because we'll do a little exercise where you will actually answer an initial question in a few minutes. Hopefully, and normally this is not so difficult because we have the phone pretty close to us. But let's get started. We have organized this session around 3 questions, as you know, and those questions are, first of all, which structures should boards create to ensure high quality oversight of sustainability? And which mix of competency does a board need to successfully address the sustainability agenda? And finally, what can boards do to move the discussion of sustainability beyond regulatory compliance? And thankfully, to help you answer these questions and give you hopefully new perspectives on this, we have 2 very, very experienced and knowledgeable people with us today. We have Jeanette Fangel Løgstrup, who is an experienced board member, author, and advisor. She is currently board member in E.G. Covi and JP Politikens, Andel Energy, Danske Invest, and other places. Besides that, Jeanette is a part of faculty at several board education programs here at CBS Executive Funding. Thank you so much, Jeanette, for joining us. It's a great privilege.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone.
Good morning. And also we have our own Andreas Rasche, who's a professor here at CBS, a professor of business in society at CBS Center for Sustainability. And Andreas's research has been published in several top-tier international journals. And he is very much into examining the intersection of corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, and the political role of firms. So 2 very wise people we have here to help us manage these questions that are up for today. But let's dig, and of course, welcome to you too, Andreas. So good to see you.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Let's start. And as I said to you before, we would very much like to start with you being a little active. So please pick up your phone, scan the barcode, and then in a maximum of 2 or 3 words, or at least very, very shortly, try to answer this question. Which area of sustainability and ESG should directors definitely build up knowledge in your opinion? Please go ahead and start typing. Yeah, now we see some answers coming in. Reporting, governance, compliance, climate, CSRD, circularity. A lot of good words. What do you make of this, Andreas and Jeanette? Please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mette. And welcome again to all of you. Great that you engage in this little exercise, because that gives me and Jeanette, of course, a good springboard here. And I'm just looking at CSRD and climate in the middle, which is kind of also what I expected, and because of course these are two huge topics that are on many boards' agenda. I'm researching it myself right now, so I also see this. Jeanette, what do you make out of this overview before we actually go into the discussion? If you look at the topics here.
Yeah, well, no doubt this is a super broad agenda. I think that's also the conclusion when you look at all the words there. So and it also tells me that there's no one size fits all. Because I mean, ESG is such a broad agenda. So depending on the industry and the company that people are working at, their focus will probably be different. So I think that's also a conclusion when you look at this.
Yes, and then let's maybe kind of jump over. One of the questions actually was, of course, on these competencies, and of course we ask here for knowledge, which is also coming close to kind of a part, at least, of the competence agenda that boards need to relate to. I always think, one big problem for boards and for directors that I talk to, one big problem that I hear very often is that they say, look, there is no standard for us to assess that, right? So how should we assess, what kind of knowledge is sufficient knowledge in this area? How would you respond to this claim?
Well, at least I would say I would probably go back and say when you're sitting in a board, the first thing is to look at your competency matrix, which of course many boards have done for years. And if you go just a few years back, often ESG and sustainability was not even mentioned there. The boards knew that they needed digitalization and governance, and somebody needed to be really strong when it came to economics and understand the industry, but never sustainability was mentioned. And that we are starting to see now, that they understand, okay, we definitely need some kind of knowledge within this area. Then I think the next thing is to zoom in much more in terms of saying, okay, so in our company, what is it then that we specifically need? And for most companies, of course, they need a bit of an overall view in terms of the full agenda. But for some companies, of course, it is very much on the E that they need to focus. And for others, if they are in a very people-heavy industry, maybe they need somebody who has a bit more insight to the S. So it's about zooming in and understanding what is really material for this company when you define then what kind of competency you need also at the board level.
Yeah, it also actually aligns quite nicely with what my research results that I'm kind of gathering right now. I mean, what I hear quite often is, that boards say, look, we look at this in a two-tiered way. On the one hand, we have the competencies that we need on the issue basis, right? Because we have certain material issues. And of course, if climate, for instance, is a highly material issue to our business, a director needs to have a basic understanding of climate. It doesn't need to be a climate scientist, obviously, but there needs to be some basic understanding here. And then I think what a lot of companies also mention is there are also these cross-cutting issues, right? I mean, they are more or less relevant to all companies in different ways. So for instance, regulations, and we saw compliance actually here as a topic. And of course, regulation for me, for instance, is an area where, of course, directors need to really upgrade their knowledge, because a lot of these new regulations have direct consequences for boards.
They do,
right?
they do.
What do you think about this kind of these new regulations and the board agenda? And how does a director really build up knowledge here? Because you don't want it to be too technical. You want it to be managerial, but you also don't want them to not do anything. So it's, in a sense, it needs to be fine-tuned.
Yeah, it does. And I think when I look at the boards where I sit, of course, what is very much on the agenda right now is regulation, and it is CRD, and everybody is struggling to get ready for that. And for the board, that does take insight in terms of what it means and what it takes to be ready at an overall level. Then what I also see is that sometimes they put some of this into to a committee. If they want to dive even deeper into CSRD, then they say, maybe this topic could be a good topic for, say, an audit committee to dive even deeper into, because it is also a bit technical, and it does take time for at least some in the boards to be a good supporter to management on a topic like this. Then you can also discuss, well, do you really need super experts in a board on a more deep theme, or do you need the full board actually to know a little bit of everything when it comes to sustainability? And I think that's also an important discussion. And my view is that the full board cannot leave responsibility just to one or two experts or to a committee. So actually the full board does need a certain level of knowledge, all of them, to be able to understand how does regulation, how does the new expectations to running a business, how does new demands in the market, what does it mean for this company, and how do we make sure that this is integrated in how we run our business, in our business strategy and all of that. So that kind of knowledge and that kind of understanding is important that the full board has. But of course, then you can have experts that knows more about certain things, or they can get access to that expertise outside of the board.
What do you think about upskilling? I had some very nice conversations with directors recently around this topic, because obviously what we are discussing here is competence development. These things don't happen overnight, right? And I think this is one of the difficult aspects of this debate, that it simply also takes some time, right? And we discussed upskilling, and he said, look, I mean, this needs to be contextualized. We can only do this on a company basis, right? I mean, because the material issues are also so idiosyncratic towards the company. And what he also said is, I mean, there is the education part, and then there is also what you mentioned in the beginning, this onboarding of new board members, because obviously there is a natural turnover. So, but there he pointed something interesting out, and I would also like to hear your perspective on that. He said it's like a catch-22. The younger generation of board members, they often come with sustainability knowledge, right? Yeah. But they don't have often, and of course we are kind of stereotyping here a bit, they often don't have the business knowledge or the business experience. The older, they often have the business experience, but then in some cases at least lack the sustainability knowledge. So it's a bit, you know, you're caught in the middle. What do you make out of this observation?
Yeah, well, I do make that you need a bit of a mix in your board, actually. And that's why also diversity, also in terms of experience, is going to be relevant. But I do think upskilling for the full board is going to be necessary going forward. And I also agree with the point that of course, it's good to have sort of a general insight to ESG and what it means, but also it has to be very company specific, because coming back to what is material for this company, that insight you also need to have. And I see many different ways of doing just that. And that could be that you set time aside for this, either at a strategy seminar, or you simply have a specific education for that specific board. Maybe you spend 1 or 2 hours once in a while where you dive deeper into this, or you have a webinar with an expert talking to you or something, or somebody from your organization educating the board about this. So there are many ways of upskilling the board so that they get the understanding. But coming back to your thing about you know, the younger ones and compared to the older ones, and the differences in competencies, I mean, what I see is also that even though that some boards know that they do need to have maybe more sustainability competence in the board, then they're not necessarily prepared to allocate a full seat just for this. And I say just in quotation mark. So often when these seats are, when you try to find the right people for the board, you often try to find somebody who knows sustainability and maybe another topic to combine it, because you don't have that many seats. So that's also often a discussion in the board when it becomes very practical.
And that is, of course, fully understandable. In a sense, I would even argue I would be against pure ESG experts in a board. I mean, you always want a broader knowledge, right? Because at the end of the day, the people are supposed to also oversee financial planning and risk management and so on. So,
and you are responsible for it all. And if you're only very narrow on sustainability, it does make your life more difficult in a board if you're not able to contribute in other areas. So I think the ideal board member is broad, but then have a spike also on sustainability, if you can find somebody like that.
Yeah, and that brings us into this kind of, we had one of the 3 questions was also around structure, and you already commented on it a bit when you talked around the committee. And what I find interesting around this committee discussion is that there are some real advocates of it. I mean, if you talk to directors, some people really say, oh, that's the way to go. You know, we need a committee here. Whereas others kind of say, no, we don't want to isolate discussions into another committee. We already have so many committees. So, you know, adding yet another one is not good. So it also comes with risks. Something that I observed in 2 companies actually, where I did interviews, was that in the ESG committee, you had almost a sense of an adverse selection. So adverse in a sense that those people with an interest in sustainability, they self-selected into the sustainability committee, whereas the rest of the board then kind of thought, oh, sustainability, that's a topic that is now being taken care of by the committee. So what do you think about these kind of pushbacks on the committee and those who also advocate for it?
I think they're super relevant discussions, and I think the risk with having a sustainability committee or an ESG committee is, of course, that it does become something on the side of the business. And as you say, then the rest of the board will feel, okay, we have delegated that topic to those guys, and then we can concentrate on running the business. And that's often how some people would perceive this. But I would say, though, if you are in a very large company and if the sustainability agenda is really complex, then it can make sense to have a sustainability committee where there is an opportunity to dive deeper into those topics and allocate more time. Basically, you can say top management who are responsible for this, they get more airtime in a committee like that. And it's an opportunity for the board to support even more. But it does not take away responsibility for the full board. So the overall discussions on what is the ambition for sustainability, how are we doing when it comes to regulation, how are we making sure that this is integrated into our business model, that we have a strong transition plan, all of these things, that still needs to be discussed in the overall board, and the overall board is still responsible for, signing the big chunks off. So you can divide some of the things, put it into a sustainability committee, but still the full board is responsible. And then I think, as you also often talk about, Andreas, that another option is, of course, to divide some of the topics and put them into some committees that you already have. As we discussed earlier on the call here, I mean, the CSRD, that could live naturally in the audit committee if a company has a such committee, because it is about controls and processes and data and reporting. So naturally, you could put more focus on that there. But of course, you could also put other topics into a committee, like that could be the REMCO or something, depending on what the topic is. So there are several ways of dividing some of the topics, which actually works, and I have seen that work well.
And of course, with the CSRD, the audit committee has to take responsibility for it, because it's part of the CSRD directive itself. So, but maybe someone could push back on that and kind of say, look, if we extend a number of committees, it becomes a little scattered, right? Because then you have the risk aspects of sustainability in the risk management committee, the reporting aspects in the audit committee. So don't you see a risk here that we then, have a coordination challenge across different committees?
I think that is a real risk. And that's why, I mean, we can never walk away from the fact that the full board needs to have the full overview of this. So if it is divided into many of the other committees, then somebody needs to make sure that the full picture is put together again and brought back to the full board. Otherwise, you risk losing sight of the overview. I fully agree on that.
And I want to turn to a question here, which nicely fits in by Giovanni. And by the way, to everybody there, please let your questions come. We are happy to engage with your questions. And of course, if you have burning questions, please let us know. So the question is, what do you think is needed to get compliant with CSRD, of course, on the board level, I presume, and what is the time and effort required to achieve full compliance within corporate? So, of course, from a board perspective here, right? So what is needed on the board level?
Well, first of all, what I see often is done is that people start with, of course, understanding the regulation overall. Then they try to start out with looking at the double materiality analysis. That's often the first step that is done. And that analysis then have to be decided in the board so that everybody agrees that, yes, these are the topics that are material for us. And then the next thing is, of course, understanding what does that then mean as requirements for what we need to report on, and also in terms of what we need to do about those topics. And that discussion also needs to be had in the boardroom. And once people have the double materiality assessment done, often they do a gap analysis to understand, okay, if this is what is needed and this is what is material, then what are we lacking in terms of being ready? Because often you don't have the data or the processes or things in place. So understanding that gap, and then on that basis, putting together a roadmap to get ready is often also what is discussed in the board in terms of understanding how far are we away from being able to live up to this. And in many boards and many companies, people at least start. Some companies start maybe 1-2 years before, because it does take time to get the data ready and so on. So that's it's a matter of how ready do you want to be and how soon, and also how much resource do you have to work with this. So the best advice is, of course, to start as early as possible, because then you do have time to get ready and not underestimate the task at hand.
And a follow-up question here would be, I mean, how much should a board actually be involved in the DMA process? Because that is of course something I've also seen this quite controversially discussed, and I've seen different things in different companies. I mean, some boards, they really became involved into this almost to a technical degree, whereas in other companies, the board more or less kind of had an oversight function, and they kind of signed off on it in the end. What is your take on this?
I think they still need to say, what is their role as a board, and that is to have the oversight and the strategic understanding of this, and then of course to challenge management when they do see the DMA. Does it really make sense? And have that kind of discussion. So not get too technical about it. It would be my advice, but of course try to understand whether it does make sense, and of course very much discuss what does it then mean for the company. If these are the material topics, then what is it we need to work with, and then make sure, and maybe that's coming back to the headline for this session, then coming back to how can we use this DMA and what it tells us to work strategically with this, so that it does become a competitive advantage potentially, instead of just a compliance exercise, because that's also what it can be used for.
And I think these are two good points. I mean, on the one hand, of course, the board is involved in the DMA process, right? I mean, they give input there, strategic input. For instance, I've seen discussions also of the board around the thresholds, which is a strategic discussion. I mean, where do you actually draw the line, right? And it is interesting also to get board feedback on that. Because at the end of the day, that also defines your universe, right? How many issues do you really need to address, and then working with the outcome of the DMA. So I think it's important to divide this up, to kind of say, I mean, there on the one hand there is the DMA process, and then there is the data that comes out of the DMA, and the board needs to really engage with the data. And as indicated in the title of this session, there is a risk, of course, right now that we have a little bit too much on the compliance side, and maybe not use particularly DMA input in a strategic way. What can be done, Jeanette, here to push boards more towards strategic thinking? Because naturally, of course, boards they have a tendency to think in compliance, right? I mean, this is their original task: monitoring, auditing, controlling. This is also where traditionally board tasks come from. How do we push the debate a little bit more in the strategic direction?
Well, of course, as we speak, since everybody is trying to get ready for CSRD, compliance is a big thing. But if you then take a step back, I think it's very much about understanding that that actually sustainability is also a value creator. This is also something that can be used to actually have a much stronger presence in the market. It's a way of attracting investors, the best people, all of that. So taking a step back, this is a way to future-proof your business. And once you have that discussion, you can also say, okay, then what is really our ambition when it comes to sustainability? How do we want to use the knowledge that we get out of the double materiality analysis? How do we use that actually to have a strong strategy in this area, and a strategy that is linked, that is part of the core business strategy, basically? How do we make sure that this is a business thing and not something on the side? And it's that discussion that you need to have in the board. What can it do for us if we do this well? How can we make sure it helps us to become a stronger business? And then, of course, it's also back to some of the practicalities in terms of understanding, okay, we need to get this into the board wheel. We need to make sure we get this into the agenda in the right context. And it's moving away from that once a year in a board, you sort of signed the annual report and that was that. No, now it has to be part of all the strategic discussions that we have. We need to think sustainability in when we have those discussions. It's also part of the people discussions. It's part of the risk discussions, so that you anchor it in each of these areas as a natural thing, because it is now a more natural part of running the business. It's that kind of mindset you need at the board.
And I think here the chairperson actually plays a quite big role, because the chairperson sets the agenda, the chairperson kind of pushes certain debates in directions. And if we want to talk about integration, I think focusing a little bit more on the chairperson is important, because this is the person who can push the integration, right? So you just mentioned, and I think this is absolutely important, that boards also look for where does the sustainability agenda and traditional board decisions intersect. Think, for instance, about incentives. I think, incentives, remuneration for executives, how are these being set? What kind of data is used in order to calculate ESG-related incentive plans? Are these ambitious? Do they align, for instance, with the DMA? I think these are, for instance, questions that push towards integration. Also, capital allocation. I think whenever capital allocation is being discussed, this could be a topic area, again, where ESG data out of a DMA can be integrated into this.
Jeanette, I think you're right, Andreas, because I think, again, it comes back to the fact that now ESG, it is core business, it is part of core business. And as you mentioned, even if you want to go to the bank and discuss your financing there, it can be part of how much you pay for that. So, the better you are on ESG, the cheaper the lending will be. Also, if you want to attract investors, it's part of that. So I mean, it's more or less now also the money that is driving this. So that's also important to understand. And then I fully agree with you in terms of thinking ESG into the incentive structures. And I also know that many investors, they are quite on this agenda as well, because I think the argument for that is, I mean, if it's an important part of the strategy for a company, then it should also be reflected, of course, in the compensation. And I think that's also what we see, at least in many of the large listed companies. Most of the big ones nowadays, they would have ESG integrated in some shape or form into the incentive structures. And I think it's a strong signal to management that we want them to succeed in this area as well.
And boards, of course, need to push here that the goals are really ambitious goals. I saw a very interesting study last year came out, which kind of looked at the payout rates of ESG-related bonuses. And for the climate area, it was, I think, 86%. So in other words, if you had a climate bonus as a senior executive, you almost had a guaranteed payout, simply because the goals were not set ambitious enough, right? So this is what the study concluded. It was a study by London Business School. And I think there is a lot to it, right? I mean, sometimes, of course, we need to set ambitious goals, but in order to set them, we need the data also. And that's why the DMA makes a big difference here. There is an interesting question here around SMEs. How should SMEs approach ESG? They often do not have kind of access to these specialized resources. also, of course, they do not have these large dedicated ESG or sustainability teams. What do boards do in smaller companies in order to engage with this debate, particularly if they don't have a kind of large sustainability team in the organization that regularly feeds them with information?
Yeah, and that is most often the case in the smaller companies, that there is simply not a big team for good reasons. So what I have seen in the smaller companies is that often the task or the responsibility for sustainability is then given to somebody else. That could be a person responsible for an area where this matters the most. In some companies, that could be HR. In other companies, it could be a production person. But I also see it anchored in the CFO area. So you try to find a way where somebody at least can own the totality of this. And then often you need to say, okay, depending on the theme within ESG, you need then to anchor it in that department where this is relevant, so that it becomes a bit more like a team effort. And you simply work with the people you have. And then what I also see is that you try to upskill the people you have, because again, coming back to the question here, I mean, most companies, they don't have the budget to go out and recruit a lot of resources, as it was also said, or experts. So they need to work with the competencies that they've got and the people they've got, and make sure that they try to get more closer to what they need to do. From the board perspective, in a smaller company, typically you don't have all these committees going on. So there often you say, this is the full board, we need to discuss it in the full board. And then we need to make sure that we have an ambition level that is fit for purpose and that fits with what this company can actually do. Coming back to what is really material, where is it we can make a difference, and then take it more stepwise, so that you don't drown in this, but actually have a roadmap that you can digest and that you can deliver on. So it's a more stepwise approach.
There is another really interesting question here around, I mean, there are also some topics, and the question starts with kind of saying, well, you know, there's a significant risk here that boards solely focus on reporting requirements, right? But we also want them to do more than that, and I fully agree with that. I mean, a board also needs to look into the substantive matters, into the impacts, into the broader sustainability agenda. But are there methods or approaches a board can take to prepare the business to understand, for instance, how to mitigate biodiversity risk or climate risk? So is that something where you see also that boards can do more to kind of, you know, raise awareness? That's at least how I understand the question.
What I see is mostly that you discuss the ambition level in the board. As an example, if you understand that, say, the climate is important for this company, which is of course for most companies, then how ambitious are we going to be on climate? Do we want to set, as an example, a science-based target? Because if we do want to do that and allocate resources for that, then you also get access to a bit of methodology for that, and a way of looking at a roadmap and a way of doing it. So it's often on that level that the boards discuss it. What is it we want to achieve? How important is it for our business, and how ambitious do we want? Because that ambition level then decides how much resource you put into it, and also how much help can you then get in terms of building your plan with the right resources and also access to experts. But this is, of course, when I mentioned this, is most in the big companies. It's different for the SMEs. But still, then there the board needs to be really aligned about the ambition level and the expectations.
Yeah, and I think it's very important what you point out here. The moment that you bring in, for instance, external target setting, right? Then a board can also kind of push the company towards, let's say, science-based targets, and once the targets are there, you establish also a certain degree of accountability. So then management has to act in order to get that done. So that is the
and then you start also to maybe integrate ESG into your internal reporting. So if you get your monthly or quarterly reporting in the boards, then you also have something on this. And you make sure that you also follow up on this at each board meeting. And that's what I've seen in many boards, that it's a natural topic more or less every time, because it's now starting to become as important. So you need to know, are we actually following, with the target? How are we doing when it comes to the targets that we have set out? And are we delivering on what we want to achieve? If not, then what are we then doing about it? So you need also that kind of transparency and visibility, not just once a year, but even more often.
How do you in general, and this is another question that we have here, the interaction between the board and management on that? I mean, the board, of course, access to the board usually goes through management, right? I mean, there is this channel. So the question here is, do your recommendations as to the awareness building that apply to the board also transfer to management? So is it something, that you would also recommend to management?
Yeah, I mean, because still, I mean, it is management who has to do the work. So again, the board role is still oversight and strategic oversight. So if you do not get management on board and get the awareness transferred to management, then you won't achieve much. So definitely it is about making sure that your management is aware of this and are as ambitious as the board is. Then, of course, coming back to competencies, what I see sometimes is that even between the meetings, if you do have somebody on your board who knows more about sustainability than maybe some of the other board members, then that board member can actually also be useful between the meetings. And then the management can have access to that person on a one-to-one basis to say, okay, now we're working on this or that, give feedback on this before we take it to the full board. So that's also a way of using the competences. If you have somebody on the board who's able to contribute even more, then you can use that person between the meetings to get access to that kind of knowledge. I see that often, and I often do that also myself.
And of course, what you mentioned also in the beginning, I think is really important, that the board also sets the ambition level here for management, because management can pretty quickly retreat into a mode that they say, look, but we don't have much room to maneuver here, because the board kind of sets us very strict boundaries in which we can operate. So I think it is also important that the board kind of encourages ambitious actions on sustainability, because otherwise it becomes a kind of chicken and egg problem. Both kind of claim that the other one is not moving. So the board ultimately is of course the organ in the organization that needs to start the push.
Yeah, and that there is an open discussion between management and board in terms of what is it we can achieve if we do this really well? What will it mean for our business? What are the business upsides for doing it? And on the other hand, what are the risks if we are not doing this well? And will we actually be a relevant company going forward? So it starts also there, with the why. Why is it we're trying to do it? Yes, of course, we need to do it for the climate, and we also need to do it because of regulation. But there is also another why, and that is it's also good for business, because you do minimize risks and you do have a potential upside in terms of your market presence. And even understanding in the board and in management, what are the expectations in the market? If you look at, as an example, the climate agenda, even if you are a smaller company and if you are a supplier to one of the big ones who have big ambitions on this, then you will potentially not be able to stay as a supplier if you don't have your house in order and if you don't have good data and good reporting. So it does also become a business risk if you're not really on top of this. So I think that discussion is also relevant both in the board and in management.
And of course, this why is important, particularly for boards who kind of start the sustainability journey, right? To really ask this question: why do we actually engage with this agenda? What is our role here? And I think this is something that's also I regularly discuss this in interviews with directors, that this why is often not asked enough in the beginning. So boards don't take the hour or two to kind of jointly reflect on what is our role in all of this? Where can we influence? Where do we want to influence? And what are redefined or enlarged fiduciary duties, for instance, with the CSRD coming in, right? I mean, it doesn't have direct effects on fiduciary duty, but there are, of course, indirect effects on it. So I think these discussions in the beginning, they need to be clarified, and this is something important. There is a question here around whether we have any thoughts on the risk of greenwashing and what can boards do in this regard. And that's actually an important question, because there is anti-greenwashing legislation on the way, again, from the European Parliament and Council. So what do you think is the role here of boards, also to address this risk? Because of course it is a risk, it can be a risk. How do boards deal with that?
Yeah, it is a risk, and it's an increasing risk. And we have seen already now examples of companies who've had trouble on greenwashing, and it will be even more difficult to get it right due to the upcoming regulation. And I think the role of the board is also to have a view on the overall communication of the company. And that comes back to both purpose. When you also set out your targets, how do you actually describe them? How do you communicate your company? You know, are you a green company? What is it you're saying? And also, of course, down to the product level, where the new regulation is also going to be quite precise in terms of what kind of documentation you need to have. So the board needs to have an overall view on this, and also be able to ask the questions in terms of if they see communication that is potentially too direct on this, and that the board is insecure, then ask the question, do we have documentation in place? And then they ask to see it.
And of course, the board can also kind of shape those aspects that often create unintended greenwashing. Actually, research shows that often greenwashing is the outcome of poor management, and the board can actually push companies towards better management practices here. I give you an example. Greenwashing appears, for instance, because different units in the organization are not aligned with each other. You know, marketing, legal, communication, sustainability, they need to talk to each other when green claims are being made. And also, of course, the board should caution, that management and the company doesn't kind of jump on each new bandwagon that is around and each new fashion in the sustainability field that is around, but that, care is being exercised. I remember the time 15 years ago when the net zero debate came out, and suddenly overnight companies were making huge claims around net zero. And back then, I think it would have been good if some boards would have said, look, let's hold back here for a moment. Let's check, what is that really? How do we achieve it? And how do we make credible claims?
Yeah, and simply understanding that we are moving into a different phase where everything you say, of course, it has to make sense overall, and you also need to be able to document what you're saying, and getting that understanding in terms of what that really means will be important for the board.
Exactly. So with this, we conclude the discussion. There is one, or actually number, but one question actually that stands out a bit. Is there a dilemma between growth and ESG? I think this is an empirical question, and I think there can be dilemmas indeed. We shouldn't make the mistake to kind of believe, that this is always a happy-go-lucky world where we can just grow and be sustainable. No, we overproduce, we overconsume, and in a sense, this is at the heart of many of the problems. So ultimately, also something that actually should be on the agenda of the board.
Yeah, and you can say it comes also back to then the business model that the companies are having. So what can they do then, given this dilemma? What can they then do to make sure that the business model that they have, that it's as circular as possible, using as less resources as possible, and all of that? So to take that discussion seriously is really crucial.
Thank you very much, Jeanette, and thanks to all of you out there. With this, I hand it back to Mette.
Thank you so much. And from my side as well, thank you to both of you. Thanks for sharing your bright minds. And I know you could go on forever and ever on these fantastic topics. And it's so important that you keep doing what you're doing out there. So thanks for that. Closing down, I just want to make one note, because if you're sitting out there and if you are actually the person with the strategic responsibility for sustainability within your organization, we are happy to announce that we are launching a brand new program for top leadership called Sustainable Leadership and Transformation, and where Andreas, among other brave minds, are behind this program. It is starting in January, and it's a 10-day program running from January to May, where we, together with, as I said, bright minds from INSEAD, Oxford, and many other places, and a lot of super cool and thought leaders within this area, have designed this fantastic program, where we will, first of all, look at how to cultivate the sustainable leadership mindset within an organization. And then we will also look at how do we align the strategy and the organization around this. And then we will finally look at how do we then actually lead the transformation as top leaders. So if you want to know more about this program, if you want to, I know many of you have already been doing some of our educational programs, and if you want to continue that lifelong learning journey, then please feel free to reach out if you want to know more about this super cool and very relevant leadership program. And actually, we do have a little info session, 30 minutes, running tomorrow morning from 8:30 to 9. I will send you the link afterwards if you could have any interested in joining. But otherwise, I just want to say thank you for your time. It was a pleasure that you wanted to spend your morning with us here, and I hope you will leave with a lot of new perspectives and food for thoughts. And yeah, go do your sustainable decisions, even more sustainable, and good luck with moving above compliance out there. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.